Good morning, folks. Instructor Gaynor here. Today's conversation will center around Chapter 16 from the text, The Fundamentals of Ethics. This chapter addresses the pluralistic model of ethics forwarded by Ross. Just recall for memory's sake, that pluralistic models reject the idea that there is a single rule or principle. They reject the idea that principles are absolute. Pluralistic models will tend to support the idea that there are more than one moral rules or principles that matter. They are non-absolute principles, rules, or values. Now, the first of the three models we are looking at, as I mentioned before, pluralistic models, is that of W. David Ross. He refers to these principles as prima facie duties. That is a Latin phrase, and by the way, it roughly means something like at face value or at first glance. He describes prima facie duties as excellent, non-absolute, permanent reasons to do or to refrain from something. Excellent, non-absolute, permanent reasons. And by the way, folks, I don't know if I would have called them all duties. I would call many of them, I would call them principles or values. Because unfortunately, when we use the word duty, I imagine many of you harken back to the way Kant thought about duties. Remember, for him, duties are absolute and binding. They're not necessarily things that you want to do, but they are things that you ought to do. I fear that when students hear these referred to as prima facie duties, they get the wrong impression that they are duties in Kant's sense. They are things that we ought to want to fulfill. But Ross recognizes that due to various issues, we are not able to fulfill them at all times. So keep in mind, these duties that he's talking about are not absolute. And that's why at one point, the author of the text even makes this claim. They are not actual duties. Why aren't they actual duties? Because unlike in Kant's sense, these are things that can be overridden. They can be overridden by other principles that seem to be more applicable in this particular situation. Anyway, now I want to reiterate this. Each of Ross's duties are fundamental. Not absolute, but fundamental. They are fundamental because they cannot be broken down to anything more simple or more basic. Irreducible to another principle might be another way of putting it. Now, on Ross's view, these are some of the potential advantages of accepting his account of ethics as opposed to the earlier absolutist models. Number one, there's more than one thing that has fundamental moral importance. To put it another way, the duties that he's talking about cannot be broken down into one basic rule. Two, it explains why we are sometimes permitted to break moral rules. Or to put it another way, in order to follow this particular duty, we may have to, unfortunately, disregard some other duty in this particular situation. I hope that's clear. Three, we'll talk about some examples in a minute to clarify. Three, it provides an explanation of the phenomenon of moral conflict. When I say moral conflict, I'm talking about the fact that we recognize in some situations that we get into these dilemmas where it would seem that we ought to do this, but it might also seem that we ought to do this. How do we figure out what we ought to do when there is a conflict like that? He contends that his position does a good job of dealing with moral conflict, as well as why we do and ought to feel regret in moral dilemmas. To put it another way, we feel regret because we wish we could actually adhere to all of the duties that he's talking about. But the real world doesn't enable us to do so. In other words, in order to do the quote-unquote right thing, we have to sacrifice particular duties in order to follow a more central overriding duty in particular situations. Now, this is my note here. Note that Ross embraces elements of both utilitarianism and Kant's notion of justice here. And my note also is, as a form of pluralism, it's possible to accept more than one principle, while none of them are viewed as absolute. Now, when we go through his list of 7 prima facie duties, I'll try to discuss which ones seem largely Kantian in flavor, which ones seem more utilitarian in flavor. Now, here is his list. You will never be in a position where I will make you rattle off these 7 duties. You will never have to rattle them off memorization style. However, just by talking about them, you will probably end up remembering them. Here they are. I will run through them. Number 1 is fidelity. Fidelity refers to the idea that we ought to keep our promises and be faithful to our word. In other words, if we say we're going to do something, we have set ourselves up for a duty to actually make good on it. To actually make good. That's what we mean by fidelity duties. Let me go off a little bit on this. Fidelity duties are central to some of our models of professional ethics. For example, if you are a practitioner in the medical field, we have what we call a fiduciary duty to those patients who are under your charge. Your duties are to be open and honest with those people. And of course, to share no private information with anybody else without the consent of the patients under your charge. That is what we call a fiduciary duty, a fidelity duty. If you are in the legal profession, you have a fiduciary duty also. The notion of lawyer-client privilege is a fiduciary duty, and I want to talk about why there's sometimes a conflict. Keep in mind, if you're a criminal defense attorney, you have a duty to do good by your client, even if you know that your client is not lily white. Now, some people think that's a problem with our criminal justice system. Well, guess what? We've got an adversary system. I have my own problems. I don't necessarily think the adversary system is the best system. However, many people would argue it's the best that we've got. And in order for the adversary system to work, lawyer-client privilege needs to be considered an overriding duty. Unless what? Well, this isn't quite a lawyer example. If you have a therapist, your counselor has a duty to you, a duty to confidentiality. According to said fiduciary duties, there are only a couple of overriding situations that would lead to the breaking, I should say, the moral and legal breaking of that fiduciary duty. If the patient is suicidal and you know that he is planning to kill himself, or if you know full well that the patient under your charge will in fact harm another person unless some kind of action is taken. In other words, there are rare instances where that privilege, confidentiality, ought to be overridden. I hope I've explained this a little bit and how this notion, applies in our professional context. By the way, folks, same way with things like journalistic ethics. Actual journalists have a fiduciary duty to the truth. Not to a political party, not to nationalism, not to the corporations that are buying ads from the news agency. This is why you can kind of see why our economic models sometimes make it very difficult to uphold that fiduciary duty of journalists that is seen to be central to the functioning of, a meaningful democratic process. The reason why we have such fiduciary duties is basically to uphold the good of the system. Anyway, I'll go on. Main reason I wanted to talk about this notion of fidelity or fiduciary duties is because it's the first time that word has actually been used in this course. So I wanted to go into some detail about how it applies to legal and professional areas of ethics that aren't quite addressed meaningfully in the text account. Now, reparations. Most people take for granted that if you do harm, you have a duty to make good on that harm that you have caused. Remember, even libertarians who argue that we have minimalist duties to other people agree that reparations are a duty that we have if we have violated another person's rights. A duty to make reparations is kind of built into any system that considers justice or fairness to be a value. We're talking about Kantian and social contractarian type values. 3, gratitude. We have never talked about gratitude yet as a value. But there is a prima facie reason why most of us think gratitude matters. I'll do it by way of example. Let's say that we do something good for someone who we don't owe anything to. And then they don't show any kind of appreciation whatsoever. Most people in that situation would be like, what the heck? I went out of my way to help so-and-so, and he didn't even thank me for it. The fact that we expect people, when we have helped them out, when we didn't have a duty to do so, to express gratitude, suggests that most people believe this is a principle that does matter. Because we tend to expect, or at least minimally expect, gratitude. And we think implicitly that there is something wrong if a person doesn't express it. Justice. Now, we talked about justice specifically in the context of Kantian moral systems as well as social contract models. This is explained by Ross as the idea that we should ensure that virtue is rewarded and vice is punished. In other words, if somebody does some horrible, wrong things, those people ought to be, quote unquote, rewarded as such, aka punished. If somebody behaves virtuously, they deserve to be rewarded for it. It is implicit in the way that we think about things, according to Ross, that these things matter to us. 5, beneficence. What does it mean to be beneficent? It means something like to do our best to do good by other people. You've ever heard the word benevolent? Benevolence means to behave with goodwill towards other people, not in the Kantian sense of goodwill, but to treat other people in ways that are beneficial to them. We ought to try to benefit other people, whether they did anything directly beneficial to us or not. We think that such ways of comporting ourselves is inherently a good thing. Number 6, a duty to self-improvement. The fact that it is implicit that we believe in a duty to self-improvement can be seen in examples of how regular people think about people who don't do good by themselves. When we see a person who has a whole lot of advantages in their life, and then they squander those advantages, we find that regrettable. We say, well, isn't that sad? So-and-so could have done this to improve his or her life, but he didn't do it. Or I hope this example doesn't hit too close to home. Let's say somebody got into problems with drug abuse, and they have an opportunity to go to rehab. You know, you probably watch these TV shows about extreme interventions and things of this nature. And when you find, you know, the whole family gets there and they say, well, we want you to go to this rehab center. We will stand behind you and try to be there for you when you go through the process. And we feel like the person has done something wrong when they say, no, I'm not going. Because we implicitly think that people have a duty to improve themselves insofar as they are capable of doing so. Now, the author of the text doesn't talk about this, but implicit in this kind of thinking is also the idea that we believe that there is something wrong with people doing things that are harmful to themselves. This is partly why the only times when we don't like it, but we find it acceptable, at least on a behavioral level, when people harm themselves if we find out that they are mentally ill. Because we know that to some extent, they're not capable of being rational agents at that point. In other words, we find it regrettable, but we're not likely to say, no gold star for that person. Because we only talk about moral gold stars or failure to get one when the person is behaving or in a rational state of mind. We have a duty to self-improvement. Finally, non-maleficence. We ought to refrain in general from doing harm to other people. Now, folks, this sounds highly utilitarian. All things considered, we ought to want to do good and to avoid harm. We should only accept doing harms when it's either unavoidable or when doing harm is likely to lead to some kind of greater good of some sort or another. But in general, we ought to try to do no harm. Now, Ross acknowledges that this is by no means a complete list, but that these 7 duties ought to be on any definitive list of ethical duties. To put it another way, he acknowledges the fact that somebody might try to float some other duty that is not somehow built into these 7 he's already put forward. However, he thinks he has, for the most part, been rather complete about it. Now, another possible strength about this position, this prima facie duties position that he's taken, is that it makes good sense of what the author calls moral regret. And I have this explained right here. It's because we believe that we did the best that we could do, while acknowledging that in order to honor one of the duties, we may have had to have broken one. Now let me consider an example. Now suppose that I promised my wife that I was going to be home at 5 p.m. from work. I made a promise that I would be home by 5 o'clock. Now suppose that on my way home, there was someone in drastic need of assistance. And if I didn't do my best to provide that assistance, that person could come to serious harm. Say it was a student having a mental breakdown or something like that. Now legally, if somebody is having a breakdown and is indeed suicidal, it is codified into the law that I have certain duties as a mandatory reporter. In other words, our legal system thinks certain things are so important that we codified it into the law. We have made them not just moral duties, but legal duties. In this situation, where one duty overrides another duty, it would make sense for me to break that particular promise. I didn't mean to break the promise, but something more important overrode that promise. And as Ross would say, I regretted the fact that I had to break my promise in order to, quote unquote, do the right thing. Now, folks, in some other situations, perhaps keeping my promise would have been the thing that would override. We can't decide ahead of time which duties ought to be honored and which ones ought to be regrettably broken. We would have to see the situation in all of its specifics and particularity in order to determine which of the duties ought to be respected and which ones would have to be overridden at that point. I have a duty to self-improvement. But what if somebody else is in dire need of help? Well, arguably, you might say that my helping other people might be arguably a part of one's moral self-improvement. So indeed, we might be able to handle this just like that. Now let's go back to some examples from the legal professions that I was talking about. If you are indeed someone's therapist, you have a fiduciary duty not to break that fiduciary duty except under very specific circumstances that the law has codified. Now, suppose that a person is telling his therapist the details of a particular affair that he has been having. You can imagine these are the things of everyday life, unfortunately. That therapist might think what, on a moral level? Well, darn it, this person who is being cheated on probably deserves to know the truth, no matter how much the truth hurts. But because of the way our fiduciary duties operate, that person has an obligation to say nothing unless there is some kind of direct harm going to take place. And that's part of the fiduciary duties built into our system. Now, any questions so far? Any questions so far? Now, keep in mind, this is one model of ethics that helps to deal with what the author calls moral conflict. The idea that there might seem to be more than one right thing to do. And you kind of wish that you could have, respected all of these duties. But the world makes that impossible. Because to respect one of the duties typically means to disrespect one of the other ones. And unfortunately, one of them's just got to give. The thing is, as responsible moral agents, you have a duty to consider all the particulars of the situation and to try to figure out which duties are paramount in this situation and which ones may need to be, unfortunately and regrettably, disrespected in this particular situation. Now, unsurprisingly, ladies and gentlemen, absolutists would object to this model. And I'll use a phrase that the author does not use, but I'm sure you have heard this phrase before. There are some people who might quickly try to object to Ross's pluralism by calling it something like this. Have you ever heard anyone condemn, hey, that's wrong, that's situational ethics? And what they mean by that is this. As soon as you start to say that there are no absolute principles that can never be broken, the floodgates to relativism, to interpreting it how you feel, seems to be the slippery slope that you're walking down. Ross would say, if you think that's what I am arguing here, you're completely misunderstood me. I am certainly not saying anything goes. I am certainly not saying that however you want to interpret this particular situation, because remember what you're required to do here. Just like in the other moral theories that we talked about, even though you have to look at situations in their particularity, you should still be taking a few steps back and trying to look at it how. You should still be doing your best to look at the situation objectively. In other words, you should still try to divorce yourself of your own biases and particularity when you're trying to figure out which duties ought to override. In other words, try to be as rational and, as far as you can, dispassionate whenever you're trying to figure out what your duties are. He is certainly not saying whatever floats your boat. He is certainly not arguing a hardcore relativist position. I mean, simply because he says you need to know the particulars, simply because he says you need to see the entire situation in order to determine which duties are more central in this situation. He's not saying that anything goes, or he's not saying it's a matter of opinion. If anyone characterizes his position there, they have set up what we call a straw man. To set up a straw man means to misrepresent or distort an opposing position. People oftentimes set up straw men because they don't really understand the situation. Or I should say, they don't understand their opponent's actual position. He would say, I'm not arguing for relativism. I am merely arguing that there is not one and only one duty. There's more than one duty. And because these duties sometimes conflict with one another, because that's just the way it's going to be, that they can't be absolute. One of them will have to be sacrificed in certain situations. Now, I think I probably talked too much already. I kind of talked about my three main points here. Absolutists sometimes cite what's called the problem of contradiction. Contradiction is not a problem for Ross. Guess why? Because none of his principles are absolute. So where there's no moral contradiction in our having to override one of the duties, one or more duties, in order to do the right thing and respect others of the duties. So contradiction is not a problem. 2, disaster prevention is also not a problem because rules can be broken if we have good reasons for doing so. Remember those cases of disaster prevention we talked about in the last chapter? If you're in a situation where you need to do harm in order to do good, there is no absolute prohibition against doing harm. In general, we ought to try not to do harm if at all possible. But if there are overriding situations that force us to do harm, then in that situation we have to do harm. But we can do so with regret. Or I should say, we would do so with regret, as Ross would put it. Number 3, he agrees that absolutism is irrational because it leads to contradictions. And my example says, for example, there are cases in which following a rule absolutely will lead to the larger breaking of the rule in the long term. The principle of utility might be an easy example to give there. In order for my maximizing utility in the here and now, it might end up creating long-term utility problems in the long term. Now, folks, this is bad utilitarianism that I'm going to give you an example of. You'll notice when people oftentimes are thinking about political issues as utilitarians, they almost always do so in a very temporally narrow way. This is one of the reasons why short-term economic interests almost always override what? Long-term economic interests. This is also why short-term interest when it comes to things like the economy will almost always trump in people's minds the environment. Even though down the line, if we don't consider environmental issues, we are all royally screwed. But of course, you say, oh, that's down the line. We'll figure out something between now and then. Meanwhile, we make things worse. But yeah, the utilitarian might object, well, that's not good utilitarianism then, because good utilitarianism means looking at things much more longitudinally and impartially. I'll give you a Kantian example. For Kant, we have a duty to be truthful, not to lie to other people. But notice that in my upholding the dignity of one person by resolutely telling the truth, I might end up disrespecting the dignity of other people if my telling the truth in that situation ends up causing harm. And this is sort of the problem with one singular principle to define them all. Because Ross would contend that what we meaningfully call morality is not reducible to one principle. He says the best we can do is talk about a list of duties that matter, and he reduced them to 7. Now, a couple more things to talk about. Please keep in mind that Ross rejects the idea that his position is mostly consequentialist. Some critics actually think it's that way. And remember, one of the overriding problems that some people had with consequentialism also was one of consequentialism's strengths. Remember, we talked about the issue of flexibility when we talked about utilitarianism. Technically, nothing was inherently wrong, because what determined right and wrong for utilitarians was what would end up bringing about the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Thus, intentionally doing harm creates a greater good would have been right for the utilitarian. Ross would never say that. As a matter of fact, even the fact that he speaks of morality in terms of duties would make him seem to more line up with whom? Say it loud. Kant. Because remember, Kant frames morality as duties. And similarly, Ross frames morality in terms of duties as well. Now, folks, I don't want to say too much about this next part, but the next part of the conversation on Ross is we will be addressing some other objections to Ross that I don't have time to talk about in this part of the lecture. We will carry on with those the next time, but just to give you one little thing. And by the way, this criticism might be made of many of the ethical theories we've already discussed. Some critics contend that one of the problems with Ross's ethics is that there is no simple and mechanical way of deciding which of these duties ought to take precedence in which situation. You can probably guess that Ross wouldn't call this a problem, because he would say that the real world is exceedingly complex. So to think that we can come up with some rough and ready formula that can tell us exactly what to do in every single situation is in some sense a failure to acknowledge the complexity of moral situations. Simply because we would probably like it if there were some simple and easy to use formula doesn't mean that there is one. Simply because we would like it if there were some kind of easy to apply moral formula doesn't mean that there is one. Thanks. Oh.